My name's Morgan and I work at the Whipple Museum of the History of Science in Cambridge, which is where we are now. And I'm the collections manager here, which means I look after the collection basically. So I make sure it's well documented, so make sure that all our objects are on the database and we have all the information that we have about the objects recorded. I also make sure they're well cared for, so I make sure that we don't have any pests eating things in the collection, that things are not dusty, so I do conservation cleaning. And it also helps with exhibitions and loans when we lend objects from our collection out to other museums. I get to work with really fantastic collections. They've been designated as internationally significant. We have things in this museum that don't exist anywhere else in the world, and that's really wonderful. Also working in a university museum, our collections are used quite frequently, so we have students write essays on objects. They come in, they might spend a whole day looking at one single object in great detail and then doing further research on it. And yet also they're used in exhibitions, in academic papers, so it's really exciting to see them used and actually get out there a bit more. What I really like about my job is that there is no typical working day. It's quite varied, but it usually involves a bit of desk work and a bit of hands-on practical work. So when I'm based at my desk, I might be answering inquiries or speaking to other museums about lending objects for their exhibitions, or I might be working on our database, making sure that the information is correct, cleaning a lot of the data, which means that it's easier to search our database. And then I'll be doing some hands-on collections work, so cleaning objects, photographing objects, marking them. At the moment, I'm working on a project called a collections review, where myself and a colleague are going through every single object by object, around the whole museum, through our stores, through the galleries. And we're making sure that all the information about it is correct and it's in the correct location. And we're also having a look at its significance, what kind of role it can play in research and teaching and exhibitions, and whether it's one of a kind or whether it's duplicated in our collection. And then we'll be looking at that and seeing which are the objects that we might have overlooked over the years and how we can better use them, or if there might be a better home for them somewhere else. For a job like mine, I need a lot of different skills. Attention to detail is really important because I do a lot of database work and I do a lot of detailed work on objects. Just being very careful is very important because I'm moving very important, one-of-a-kind, valuable things around. There's a lot of museum-specific skills, so when I talk about cleaning the objects, it's not getting your usual cleaning products out. It's very careful dusting of objects with a paintbrush and a special vacuum cleaner. So there's a lot of delicate work. And then there are lots of skills that you might find anywhere. So I also do the museum's social media, and I do lots of writing, so sort of general writing skills. Yeah, so a wide range of skills. I didn't always know that I wanted to work in museums, so I have a history degree, and after I finished I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, so I did some other jobs for a few years, and then I began volunteering in a museum and really enjoyed it and thought that was something that I wanted to do. So I did a master's in museum studies, which is a common route into the sector, and I did some volunteering, and then I also did a traineeship, which is another route into the sector and doesn't normally require that you have a museum studies master's. So I sort of came in two ways. And the traineeship had lots of on-the-job training. So I did 4 days a week working and 1 day a week training, which trained me in all the specific museum skills. And then I sort of worked my way up through many jobs since. For someone who's looking for a job like mine, if you have the time and the money, then you could look at doing a museum studies master's or volunteering in a museum where you gain some museum-specific skills. If you can't do that, then I would look at how you can gain transferable skills from other jobs. So I do a lot of manual handling and looking after things carefully, and those are the sort of skills that you can pick up in a warehouse or a supermarket. I also work with databases, which you can get experience on databases in admin jobs. So you don't necessarily have to just volunteer or get a degree in museum studies. I think you can pick up lots of relevant skills in other areas.
My name is Sophie Rowe and I'm a conservator, and we're here in the Polar Museum, which is part of the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, and I've worked here for 7 years. So what a conservator does is we are responsible for looking after objects in museums. And that might involve both repairing them, and I guess people often think about restoration, and that's sort of a traditional idea about what conservators do. But the other thing we do is look after them in their context in the museum, and that might be when they're on exhibition or where they are in storage, or if they're going to go out on loan. We're kind of making sure that the conditions that they're in and the way they're handled and the way they're stored or shown is safe for them. Because the idea is just to preserve the objects for as long as you can in the collection so that they are of use and benefit to people for as long as you possibly can manage. Conservators can end up doing a really wide variety of different tasks, and it depends a bit what kind of institution you're in, or even if you're in private practice. So in some big museums, the conservators will spend a lot of their time doing treatments. But if you work in a smaller museum like this one, you'll very often get involved in particularly storage and management of collections. And so there is quite a lot of overlap with what a collections manager does. But it focuses more on the stability of artefacts and their health, you might say. Whereas collections management, I think, looks more at object information. So that's kind of the slight distinction. It's a great job. I love conservation. It's really fun. I would have to stick my hand up and say I definitely have a bit of a nerdy streak, and most of the conservators I know have a bit of a nerdy streak, and we find artefacts really cool, and we find that it's just possible to get interested in all kinds of things, perhaps things that surprise you. The thing that appealed to me about it when I first started was I wanted a job where I got to use my head and my hands. I've always really liked doing practical things. So the whole kind of craftsmanship aspect of it and being, really involved with artefacts and trying to make fantastic repairs on them also really appealed to me. So it's a kind of combination of an intellectual and a practical role. The other thing about it that's really fun is the variety. So if you're a young person and you want to get into conservation, there are a number of different ways that you can do that now, which is great. One possibility is that you can do an undergraduate degree in conservation. I think there are a couple of places in the UK which will teach that. One of them is in Cardiff, and I think the other one's in Lincoln. And they focus on conservation of artefacts, like the kind of thing you might see in this museum object in the round. There are also master's courses, so once you've got an undergraduate degree in kind of anything you want, you can then go and do a master's course in conservation, and they tend to be a bit more specialised, so they'll often focus on maybe conservation of paper or conservation of textiles. I did a course at University College London, which was in the Institute of Archaeology, and it's called Conservation for Archaeology in Museums. And they've restructured it a bit since I was doing it, but basically now it's 2 master's degrees, one after another. The first one is kind of principles and scientific principles of conservation, and I should mention that you need to have some chemistry. So if you don't have a chemistry A level, then you'll need to learn some chemistry before you can do that course. And then the second half involves a year in the lab where they sort of teach you lots of practical techniques, and then you have a year on placement in a museum or another work setting where they train you. So that part of it's really, really important. But obviously both undergraduate and postgraduate training like that is quite expensive for people. So I'm really glad to know that they've also now introduced in the last year an apprenticeship scheme, which is a level 7, so it's the top level apprenticeship scheme. I think it's the same level as you have for doctors actually. And you can now get an apprenticeship which allows you to work and train as a conservator at the same time. So that opens things up to a wider range of people, which I think is really great. So this is a gut parka. It came into the museum a couple of years ago in a sort of surprise box full of a lot of other artefacts, and it was all rolled up, so we actually didn't know what it was at all, and discovered that we have this really incredible piece of clothing. It's basically intended to keep you waterproof while you're hunting from a kayak, and it's made from seal intestines that have been dried and then split open and sewed in lots of strips, so you can see a sort of pattern of strips that are all kind of sewed together with sinew. And it's just a really lovely piece of clothing, a really nice example of this culture from Greenland, and so we really wanted to put it on display and show it as it would look in life, because very often when you see these things displayed in museums, they're with their arms out and they look a bit artificial. So the idea was to produce a mount that was going to really keep it in a good, solid, supported state while it's on display. So you can see that it has a paper mount underneath that we've made. Very, very lightweight, rigid shell, which provides support for the inside, and then the arms are separately padded, and then there's a hoop of paper up the inside of the hood to keep the hood in shape. So it's quite often something that you do in conservation to build a mount that really does a lovely job of supporting an object, because you can achieve a lot that way without actually interfering with the material of the object itself. One of the things that's really great about this display is that we're able to show the kayak, which is behind me, and then we have the piece of waterproof jacket that you would wear, and also the spray deck, which keeps the water out of the kayak. So now you can see the whole assemblage of how someone would go hunting and what they would wear to go hunting from a kayak. You need to have an eye for detail. You need to have craft skills or hand skills, but you also need to be kind of open to the bigger picture of what is a museum trying to do and trying to support that, and be open to working with people who are coming from a slightly different point of view and making these things happen. I think I would, if you can, find a way to just get some experience in museums, find out what a museum is like, and perhaps look around at different kinds of museums. You know, there's quite a range, both big institutions but also small ones, and things that focus on different types of objects, you know, things that have a social history interest or an archaeological interest or art. You know, there's quite a lot of different ranges of things that you might find in a museum. So, yeah, I would make yourself as familiar as you can with the context that you might be working in, and find out what you get excited about.
So what really excites me about my job is the fact that I get to hang out in this place all the time. It's a place full of fossils, full of stories, full of interesting snippets. It's not just how they were collected, what they show us about evolution, but it's the people that collected them, it's the stories, it's the histories, it's the hidden histories, the things that we don't quite know about that we can find out. For me, a museum's a really rich place. And it's a really special place, and it's really nice to be sitting here and sort of sharing that space. And I think that for me is that sort of the special, the privilege of working with these collections and working with the people that I do is a really important part of that. So I'm Liz Hyde. I'm the director of the Sedgwick Museum. Sedgwick Museum is the University of Cambridge Geology Museum, so we have a huge collection of rocks and fossils. You'll see some of them behind me, and that includes dinosaurs. We also have a large collection of rocks in our external store as well, which isn't out on display to the public at the moment. So I'm the director here, which means that I have oversight of the whole operation, and we're part of the Department of Earth Sciences, which is the research department of the university. So I report into that, and I play a part in that. And our role as this university museum is to open to the public, of course, but we also support teaching and research in the university as well. So we have students coming in, we have researchers looking at our collections, as well as all the stuff that we do for the public. Part of what I do is a curatorial role, and I think being a curator, it's quite an interesting concept of what it means, because different museums and different disciplines between the sciences and the arts mean slightly different things, what a curator does. But for me, at the heart of it, what it is, it's being that expert. It's that specialist knowledge. It's knowledge about the collections and knowledge about how you can interpret them and how you can share them and how you might put them together and how you might sort of draw parallels and themes together through them. So that's my role, is coming into that as somebody who's studied paleontology in my case and has expertise on the collections, and bringing that to the public programs that we do, but also with the research and the care of the collections. So there is quite a bit of training, but I think there's different ways into this, and like I say, being a curator is quite different. A curator in a really small museum is very different from a curator in a large museum. In a large museum, you'll have a real specialism, and you'll be expected to really study a subject in quite detail, and so would have quite a lot of specialist training. In a small museum, your training would be different because you'll be juggling other things. In a small museum where you might be the only member of staff, you might be opening the museum, raising funds. You might be the one that's putting the bucket under the drip in the roof when it needs to, too. So the sort of skills you need for that are very different. For all of these, I think people skills and experience in working in different environments is really useful. I think there's a lot of people that aren't quite sure what curators do, but they know that museums have curators. And I think that's quite, people think, I really want to work in that museum, I must be a curator. But actually in museums there are lots of jobs. As I'm sure we can see, there's lots of jobs. The curator or the curators are the ones that have the specialist and detailed knowledge. So often when I talk to young people about whether they want to go into museums, I talk to them about, well, what is it that you like? Is it because you want to sit and really study those fossils? But actually, do you want to be communicating them? Do you want to be thinking about ways that you can interpret them? And one of the ways that curation has changed over the last 20, 30 years is that probably 30 years ago you could be a curator and you could sit in a dusty store and never talk to anybody. And quite a lot of people have that stereotype of a curator as being like that, but no way. There's no way you can do that now. Curating is part of communicating. It's about sharing it. And whether I'm sharing the fossils with researchers, whether I'm talking to them, whether I'm talking to students, or whether talking in the gallery to the public, thinking about how we might put on exhibitions that help people understand the fossils. That's what curation is really about, that interface between people and objects. So if you're thinking of coming into roles like this, there are apprenticeships, but there are also junior roles. For example, in the museum right now, we're advertising what we consider to be an entry-level role. It's not something that we're expecting people to have lots of experience in, but we want people to come and, in our case, help moving our rock collection into its new store. So there are junior roles where you can learn that experience, and I think there's nothing really beats that sort of hands-on experience. And that might just be taking on roles that are a few weeks long. It might just be taking on little traineeships and things, but it's about getting that experience, and I think looking out for that. I'm really interested in what people can bring, what skills and experience and ideas and enthusiasm they can bring to it. One of the things that I think is really a real big opportunity is for young people coming into museums. For me, museum is all about making our collections relevant to people. And that's not just about making it relevant to older people. We want to make them relevant and interesting and inspiring for young people too. And the best people to do that are young people themselves. I think it's very easy to be misled by a stereotype of what museum workers are. I think there's a stereotype of a dusty curator, that the museum is full of drawers of things that are never opened. A museum is actually a really rich, dynamic place to work. We want people who've got ideas and energy and experiences to bring to that. So if I went back and I talked to my younger self about where I am now, I'd think stop worrying and be confident in what you can do. Because I think a lot of us, particularly young women, we think we're not good enough. And actually you often are. You really are. And I think if you can feel confident in what you can do and what you can bring to an organisation, that's going to take you so much further. I think, don't be intimidated by what's out there. Step in there and do it.